I never believed in ghosts until I started my pediatric residency at St. Catherine's Hospital. The building itself was over 100 years old, with long corridors that seemed to stretch into darkness no matter how many fluorescent lights flickered overhead. During my first week, the senior residents would joke about the night visitors, patients who couldn't let go, they said, laughing it off as superstition born from exhaustion and too many double shifts. I dismissed their stories as the kind of dark humor medical professionals develop to cope with the weight of loss. But on my third night working the graveyard shift, everything I thought I knew about reality began to unravel. It was 2:47 a.m. when I first saw him. I remember the exact time because I just finished updating a patient chart and glanced at my watch, calculating how many hours until I could finally sleep. The pediatric ward was unusually quiet that night. Most of our young patients were stable, sleeping peacefully under the watchful eyes of the night nurses. I was making my rounds, checking vitals and adjusting for drips, when I noticed a small figure standing at the end of the hallway near room 408. He appeared to be around 7 or 8 years old, wearing a hospital gown that seemed too big for his thin frame. His dark hair hung over his forehead, and even from a distance, I could see he was barefoot on the cold linoleum floor. My first instinct was concern rather than fear. Children sometimes wandered at night, disoriented from medication, or simply unable to sleep in an unfamiliar environment. I approached him slowly, keeping my voice soft and gentle. "Hey there, buddy," I called out. "Are you okay? Did you need something?" The boy didn't respond immediately. He just stood there, perfectly still, his arms hanging at his sides. As I got closer, I noticed something odd about him, a quality I couldn't quite put into words at the time. It was as if the light around him was slightly different, dimmer somehow, like he existed in his own pocket of shadow. When I was about 10 feet away, he finally looked up at me. His eyes were dark and deep, filled with emotion I initially interpreted as sadness. "I can't find my room," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. It had a strange quality to it, like an echo in an empty hallway. I smiled, trying to put him at ease. "That's okay. I can help you find it. What's your room number?" He tilted his head slightly, as if considering the question. "408, he replied. I glanced down the hallway toward room 408, which was actually right behind where he was standing. "Well, you're practically there already," I said with a gentle laugh. "Come on, let's get you back to bed." I reached out to place a hand on his shoulder, to guide him back to his room, but my hand passed through empty air where he should have been standing. In that split second, he was simply gone. Not walking away, not running, just gone, as if he'd never been there at all. I stood frozen in the hallway, my heart suddenly pounding in my chest, my hand still extended into nothingness. The rational part of my brain immediately began searching for explanations. I was exhausted, I told myself. I'd been awake for over 20 hours. I was seeing things, hallucinating from lack of sleep. It was the only logical explanation. I walked to room 408 and gently pushed open the door, half expecting to find the boy tucked safely in his bed. But the room was empty. Not just empty of patients. Completely empty. No bed, no monitors, no medical equipment. Just bare walls and a window with closed blinds. I checked the chart holder outside the door, but there was nothing there either. According to the ward roster I'd reviewed earlier that evening, room 408 wasn't even in use. I stood there for several minutes, trying to process what had just happened, before finally convincing myself it had been a trick of the light, a shadow, my overtired mind playing tricks on me. I didn't tell anyone about that first encounter. What would I say? That I'd seen a ghost? That I was so sleep-deprived I was hallucinating children in the hallway? Either way, it wouldn't look good for a first-year resident trying to prove herself capable. I finished my rounds mechanically, checking on each patient with extra attention to detail, as if perfect work could somehow erase what I'd witnessed. When my shift ended at 7 a.m., I drove home in a daze, the image of that boy's sad, dark eyes burned into my memory. I told myself it wouldn't happen again, that I had just been tired, that everything would return to normal. I was wrong on all counts. The boy appeared again the next night, and the night after that, each time around the same hour, always between 2:30 and 3 a.m., and always in the same location near room 408. The encounters followed a similar pattern. He would be standing in the hallway. I would approach him, he would say something brief, and then he would vanish. Sometimes it happened when I looked away for just a second. Other times he would fade slowly, becoming translucent before disappearing entirely. But he was always there, night after night, as reliable as the sunrise I stumbled toward after each exhausting shift. On the fourth night, I decided to try speaking with him before approaching too closely. "Hello," I called out when I spotted him in his usual spot. "I've seen you before. What's your name?" He looked at me with those impossibly dark eyes, and for the first time, I noticed other details about his appearance. His hospital gown had old-fashioned ties at the back, the kind we hadn't used in years. His skin had an unusual pallor, not quite the sickly gray of an ill child, but something else, an absence of color rather than an unhealthy hue. "My name is Timothy," he said in that whisper-soft voice. "I'm waiting for my mom." The simple statement broke my heart in a way I couldn't fully explain. I wanted to help him, even though I was becoming increasingly certain that he wasn't a living patient. "When was the last time you saw your mom, Timothy?" I asked gently. He seemed to think about this for a long moment, his small face scrunching up with concentration. "I don't remember," he finally said. "It was before the surgery. She was crying. She held my hand and told me everything would be okay." His words sent a chill down my spine. "What surgery?" I asked, taking an involuntary step forward. But as soon as I moved, he was gone again, vanishing like morning mist under sunlight. I began researching the hospital's history during my breaks, spending hours in the medical library poring over old records and archives. St. Catherine's had been a teaching hospital since 1923, and the pediatric wing had seen thousands of patients over the decades. But finding information about a specific child named Timothy who had undergone surgery proved nearly impossible. The older records weren't digitized, and many had been lost to fires, floods, and simple neglect over the years. I did discover that room 408 had been a surgical recovery room in the 1970s and early 1980s, before the wing was renovated and redesigned. That information only raised more questions. By the end of my first month, I had become obsessed with Timothy's nightly appearances. I started arriving early for my shifts, preparing questions to ask him, hoping to piece together his story. The other residents noticed my distraction, but attributed it to the typical stress a new doctor adjusting to the brutal hours and emotional weight of pediatric medicine. My supervising physician, Dr. Margachin, pulled me aside one evening to ask if I was coping okay. "You seem tired," she observed, her sharp eyes studying my face. "More than the usual resident exhaustion. Are you sleeping enough on your days off?" I assured her I was fine, that I was just dedicated to my work, but I could tell she didn't entirely believe me. Timothy began opening up more during our encounters, though our conversations were always brief before he vanished. He told me he liked airplanes and wanted to be a pilot. When he grew up, he said his favorite food was chocolate ice cream, and his best friend was a boy named Marcus who lived next door. These mundane details made him feel more real, more present, and more tragic. Here was a child with dreams and preferences, someone who had existed fully in the world, now reduced to a ghostly echo in a hospital hallway. I found myself looking forward to seeing him, despite the supernatural impossibility of it all, because for those few minutes each night, I could offer him the comfort and attention that someone should have given him when he was alive. One night, about 6 weeks into my residency, Timothy appeared earlier than usual, just after midnight. I was updating charts at the nurse's station when I felt that peculiar cold spot that now signaled his presence. I looked up to find him standing directly in front of the desk, closer than he'd ever been before. "Dr. Sarah," he said, using my name for the first time. I'd never told him my name. He'd never asked, "I need to tell you something important." His face was more serious than I'd ever seen it, his dark eyes urgent. The surgery room. Room 408. Something bad happened there. Something that shouldn't have happened. Before I could ask what he meant, he flickered like a faulty light bulb and disappeared, leaving me alone with a growing sense of dread. I knew I had to find out what happened in room 408, but the hospital's official records only went back so far with any useful detail. The oldest files stored on-site dated to the mid-1990s, long after the room had been converted from surgical recovery to general patient use, and then ultimately to storage. I needed to dig deeper, to find records from the 1970s and 1980s when Timothy had most likely been a patient. My search led me to the hospital's off-site archive facility, a climate-controlled warehouse on the outskirts of the city, where decades of medical records were stored in endless rows of filing cabinets and boxes. Getting access wasn't easy. I had to submit a formal request to the hospital administration, claiming I was researching historical pediatric surgical outcomes for an academic paper. It took 2 weeks for approval to come through, during which time Timothy appeared every single night, always with the same urgent message. Room 408. Something bad happened. His distress seemed to be growing stronger with each appearance, and I noticed he was becoming more substantial, more visible. Other staff members began commenting on cold spots in the hallway and strange shadows near the old storage room. The night nurse, Maria, who'd worked at St. Catherine's for over 20 years, mentioned that she felt a presence in that area before, but had always attributed it to the building's age. Finally, on a Saturday afternoon, I drove to the archive facility with my authorization letter and a desperate need for answers. The archivist, an elderly man named Mr. Patterson, who seemed to have been there as long as the records themselves, led me to the section containing pediatric surgical records from the 1970s and 1980s. "We don't get many requests for these old files," he said, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "Most researchers focus on recent cases where the outcomes and methodologies are more relevant to current practice." I thanked him and settled in at a dusty table with stack after stack of deteriorating file folders. I spent hours searching through records, my eyes straining to read faded typewritten reports and handwritten notes. Many files were incomplete, damaged by time and poor storage conditions in the years before they'd been moved to the climate control facility. I found dozens of children who'd undergone surgery in room 408, most with positive outcomes. Some with complications, a few with tragic endings, but none named Timothy. I was about to give up, convinced I was searching for a ghost story that had no basis in documented reality, when I found a file folder that had been misfiled in the wrong year section. The label read, Patient 4-0-8, T, cardiac surgery, August 1981. Inside was Timothy's file, though it took me a moment to realize it because his full name was listed as Timothy James Morrison, age 7. The photograph clipped to the inside cover showed the same boy I'd been seeing every night. The dark hair, the thin face, those deep eyes that now stared at me from a decades-old Polaroid. My hands trembled as I read through his medical history. Timothy had been born with a congenital heart defect that had worsened as he grew older. By the summer of 1981, surgery had become necessary to save his life. He'd been admitted to St. Catherine's on August 15th, his surgery scheduled for August 18th. His mother's name was listed as Linda Morrison, a single parent with no other family noted in the records. The surgical notes were where the story took a dark turn. The operation had been performed by Dr. Raymond Blackwell, a cardiac surgeon who had privileges at St. Catherine's from 1975 to 1983. According to the initial report, the surgery had gone well, with Timothy transferred to room 408 for recovery. But then the notes became scattered and defensive in tone. There were gaps in the monitoring records, periods of 30 to 40 minutes where no vitals had been documented. A nurse's note dated August 19 at 3:17 a.m. stated, "Patient found in distress, code blue called." The subsequent reports were clinical and brief. Timothy had gone into cardiac arrest, resuscitation attempts had failed, Time of death recorded as 3:42 a.m. But there was more. Tucked into the back of the file was a separate document, a copy of an internal hospital investigation report. My heart raced as I read it. The report indicated that serious questions had been raised about Timothy's postoperative care. The overnight nurse assigned to monitor him, a woman named Sandra Clemens, had been found sleeping at the nurse's station during her shift. She'd failed to respond to alarms from Timothy's monitors, which showed he'd been in distress for at least 20 minutes before anyone discovered him. By the time the Code Blue team arrived, it was too late. The investigation concluded that proper monitoring might have prevented Timothy's death, that the cardiac episode could have been caught and treated if someone had been watching him. The final page of the report made my blood run cold. It detailed the aftermath and the hospital's response. Sandra Clemens had been quietly dismissed, her nursing license suspended. Dr. Blackwell had continued practicing, but had voluntarily left St. Catherine's a few years later. Most damning of all was a notation about a settlement. The hospital had paid Linda Morrison an undisclosed sum in exchange for her agreement not to pursue legal action or speak publicly about her son's death. Timothy's case had been buried, covered up, reduced to a file folder hidden in archives that no one was expected to ever review. He had died alone in room 408, abandoned by the very people who were supposed to be saving him. And then his story had been erased from institutional memory. I left the archive facility in a daze, Timothy's file folder carefully tucked into my bag, despite the questionable ethics of removing it from the facility. I knew what I discovered was significant, possibly even dangerous to certain people if it came to light. But more than that, I finally understood why Timothy kept appearing, why he was trapped in that hallway, why he couldn't move on. He was waiting for someone to acknowledge what had happened to him, to recognize that his death had been preventable and unjust. He was waiting for someone to care enough to uncover the truth that had been deliberately hidden. That night, I arrived at the hospital 2 hours early for my shift. I went directly to room 408, the old storage room where Timothy had died over 40 years ago. I brought with me his file, a candle, and a photograph I'd carefully removed and photocopied. The Polaroid of 7-year-old Timothy, smiling bravely for the camera on his admission day. I didn't know if what I was planning would work, if speaking to the dead was even possible beyond the brief encounters we'd been having. But I had to try. I owed him that much. Every child deserved to have their story told, their life and death acknowledged as meaningful. I sat on the floor of the empty room and began to speak, my voice echoing off the bare walls. Timothy, my name is Dr. Sarah Mitchell, and I know what happened to you. I know about your surgery, about the nurse who fell asleep, about how you died alone when someone should have been watching over you. I know about the cover-up, the settlement, how they tried to make everyone forget. Tears were streaming down my face as I spoke, the full weight of this child's tragedy finally hitting me. I'm so sorry. I'm sorry no one was there for you when you needed help. I'm sorry they buried your story. You deserve better than that. You deserve to live and become a pilot and eat chocolate ice cream with your friend Marcus. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, dramatically, my breath becoming visible in the cold air. The candle flame flickered wildly despite the lack of any breeze. And then Timothy was there, standing in front of me more solid and real than I'd ever seen him. He looked down at me with those dark eyes, but this time I could see something else in them. Recognition, gratitude, and a deep sadness that no child should ever have to carry. You found me, he said simply. You didn't forget about me like everyone else did. I shook my head, wiping tears from my cheeks. No one's going to forget about you, Timothy. Not anymore. We talked for what felt like hours, though it might have been only minutes. He told me about the surgery, how scared he'd been going under anesthesia, how he'd woken up in room 408 feeling strange and weak. He'd pressed the call button when his chest started hurting badly, but no one came. He'd tried to get up, to find help, but he was too weak and dizzy. The monitors were beeping loudly, he said, but still no one came. He'd felt his heart beating wrong. fluttering and racing and then slowing, and he'd known something was very wrong. I called for my mom, he said quietly, but she wasn't there. No one was there. I was alone and I was scared, and then everything went dark. The pain in his voice was unbearable. I reached out instinctively to hug him, and to my surprise, I felt substance beneath my hands, not quite solid, but not entirely incorporeal either. He was cold, so cold, but present in a way he hadn't been during our hallway encounters. Your mom loved you so much, I told him, remembering the note in his file, about Linda Morrison crying and holding his hand before surgery. She never stopped loving you, Timothy. None of this was your fault. You were just a kid who got sick, and the people who were supposed to take care of you failed. But that failure was on them, not on you. He pulled back slightly to look at me. Can I go now? He asked. Can I find my mom? She must be worried about me. The question broke my heart, because I knew what he meant. Linda Morrison had probably passed away years ago. Timothy could finally join her, but his spirit had been trapped here, reliving that awful night, waiting in that hallway for someone to help him the way he'd waited in room 408 for a nurse who never came. Yes, I whispered. Yes, Timothy, you can go. You can rest now. You don't have to wait here anymore. He smiled then, a genuine smile of relief and happiness that transformed his sad little face into something beautiful and innocent. The light in the room began to change, growing brighter despite the late hour and lack of windows. Timothy's floor became more translucent, starting to fade, but slowly this time, peacefully. Thank you, Dr. Sarah, he said, his voice growing distant. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for remembering. And then he was gone, not vanished in the abrupt way he'd been disappearing, but faded gradually like morning fog burning off under the sun. The room temperature returned to normal. The candle flame steadied, and I was alone. But the feeling in that space had changed completely. The oppressive weight, the sense of tragedy and unfinished business, had lifted entirely. Room 408 felt like just another empty room in an old hospital, nothing more. I sat in that room for a long time after Timothy left, processing everything that had happened and deciding what to do with the information I'd uncovered. I knew that bringing this story to light would cause problems. Hospital administrations didn't appreciate residents digging up old scandals, especially ones involving potential malpractice that had been quietly settled decades ago. But I also knew I couldn't stay silent. Timothy deserved to have his story known, and more importantly, the circumstances that led to his death needed to be examined so they could never happen again. The next day, I requested a meeting with Dr. Chun, my supervising physician, and Dr. Robert Harrison, the current chief of pediatrics. I brought with me copies of everything I'd found: Timothy's medical file, the investigation report, the settlement documentation. I also brought a written statement detailing my experiences over the past 2 months, knowing full well how insane it would sound to claim I'd been visited by a ghost. But I was prepared to risk my credibility, my residency, even my future career, to ensure Timothy's story wasn't buried again. Dr. Chun and Dr. Harrison listened to my account with expressions that shifted from skepticism to concern to outright disbelief and back again. Dr. Mitchell, Dr. Harrison finally said, when I'd finished, "What you're describing, these nightly encounters with a deceased patient, that's not something we can include in any official report or investigation. You understand that, don't you?" I nodded. I understand it sounds impossible, but the documented facts in this file are real. A 7-year-old boy died here because of negligent care, and the hospital covered it up. That part isn't supernatural. That's just tragic reality. Dr. Chin picked up the investigation report and read through it carefully, her expression growing more troubled with each page. "This happened before either of us worked here," she said. "But if these documents are authentic, they represent a serious failure in patient care and institutional ethics." She looked at Dr. Harrison. "We need to report this to the hospital board and the medical ethics committee. We also need to review our current policies for overnight patient monitoring to ensure something like this couldn't happen today." Dr. Harrison looked uncomfortable but nodded slowly. Agreed. But Dr. Mitchell, I need you to understand that there will be consequences for removing archival documents without authorization and for making accusations about historical practices based on what you admit were supernatural encounters. I accepted whatever consequences would come. Over the next several weeks, the hospital conducted an internal review of Timothy Morrison's case and the circumstances surrounding his death. Several retired staff members were interviewed, including Sandra Clemens, the nurse who'd been dismissed and who was now in her 70s living in a nursing home. According to Dr. Chun, who sat in on that interview, Sandra had broken down crying and admitted she'd taken sleeping pills during her shift that night because of personal problems and had failed in her duty to monitor Timothy. She'd lived with the guilt for over 40 years. The hospital's review confirmed everything I'd found in the archives. The board issued a formal acknowledgement of the failure in Timothy's care and a posthumous apology to him and his family. They updated the patient care protocols, including mandatory double-checking systems for overnight monitoring and strict policies against nurses working alone during night shifts. Most significantly, they established a memorial in the hospital chapel, a small plaque reading, "In memory of Timothy James Morrison and all young patients lost under our care. We remember them, we learn from their stories, and we commit to doing better." The hospital administration handled my unauthorized removal of archival documents with surprising leniency. I received a formal reprimand in my file, but Dr. Chin privately told me that several board members were impressed by my dedication to uncovering the truth, even if my methods were questionable. "You put your career at risk for a child you never met," she said. "That's the kind of fierce advocacy patients need. Just maybe use proper channels next time." Dr. Harrison, though initially disapproving, eventually admitted that the case had exposed serious gaps in historical accountability and had led to meaningful policy improvements. I tried to find Linda Morrison's family to tell them about Timothy's memorial, but my searches came up empty. Linda had died in 1995, according to public records, with no other relatives listed. Timothy had truly been alone in the world except for his mother, which made his story even more heartbreaking. But I like to think that wherever they were now, they were together again, and that Timothy had finally gotten to tell his mom about seeing a hospital, about waiting for her, about the doctor who'd finally listened to his story. My experience changed how I practiced medicine. I became known among the staff and other residents as someone who took patient advocacy seriously, sometimes to the point of being difficult or challenging to administration. But I also became someone that families trusted, someone who would fight for answers and refuse to let things be swept under the rug. I'd learned from Timothy that every patient, living or dead, deserved to have their story heard and respected. The months following Timothy's departure and the revelation of his story were transformative for me personally and professionally. My residency continued, the brutal hours and emotional weight of pediatric medicine slowly forging me into the doctor I want to become. But I carried Timothy with me in everything I did, in every patient interaction, in every decision I made. His tragic death and the subsequent cover-up had taught me that institutions, even well-meaning ones like hospitals, could prioritize reputation over truth, and that sometimes justice required someone willing to risk comfort and security to speak up. The other residents treated me differently after word spread about what I'd uncovered. Some were impressed, calling me brave for exposing a historical injustice. Others thought I was reckless or attention-seeking, suggesting I'd invented the ghost story to make my discovery seem more dramatic. I let them think what they wanted. I knew what I'd experienced, and Timothy's vindication was all that mattered to me. Dr. Chin became a mentor and ally, often discussing ethical dilemmas with me and encouraging my instinct to question accepted practices when something felt wrong. I never saw Timothy again after that night in room 408, though I often felt his presence in subtle ways, a sudden sense of peace during particularly difficult shifts, a fleeting glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision that reminded me I was never truly alone in the hospital. Other staff members reported that the cold spots and strange shadows in the old pediatric wing had vanished entirely. Room 408 was eventually renovated and returned to active use as a patient room, and numerous children recovered there over the following years without incident. The space that had once felt heavy with tragedy now felt normal, just another hospital room where healing could happen. I made it a personal mission to learn the stories of other patients who died at St. Catherine's under questionable circumstances, though I found no other ghosts. What I did find was a pattern of institutional reluctance to examine past mistakes closely, a culture protecting reputations over seeking truth. I began advocating for more transparency in medical error reporting and for support systems that will allow healthcare workers to admit mistakes without fear of career-ending consequences. It was complicated work that made me unpopular in some administrative circles, but I'd learned from Timothy that silence served no one in the long run. During my second year of residency, I treated a patient whose case echoed Timothy's in frightening ways. A young girl named Emma with a congenital heart defect requiring surgery. I was assigned to her post-operative care team, and I became almost obsessive about her monitoring, checking on her personally every 30 minutes throughout my shifts, ensuring alarms were functioning, verifying that nurses were alert and responsive. My supervising team initially found my vigilance excessive, but when Emma developed complications in the early morning hours, we caught them immediately because I was already at her bedside. She made a full recovery, and her parents never knew how close they had come to losing her, or how the memory of a boy who died 40 years ago had saved their daughter's life. The experience brought everything full circle for me. Timothy's death had been meaningless in the moment, a tragedy compounded by cover-up and institutional failure. But by forcing me to uncover his story, by haunting those hallways until someone paid attention, he'd created meaning from that tragedy. His death had led to policy changes, renewed vigilance, and ultimately to Emma's survival. I couldn't help but think that maybe this was what he'd been waiting for all along. Not just acknowledgement of what happened to him, but assurance that his death would prevent future deaths, that his story would protect other children. I visited Timothy's memorial plaque regularly, sometimes bringing flowers, sometimes just standing there in quiet reflection. I'd tell him about patients I'd saved, challenges I'd overcome, mistakes I'd made and learned from. I'd thank him for choosing me, for trusting me with his story, for teaching me that being a doctor meant more than just medical knowledge and technical skill. It meant being willing to see and hear patients completely, even when that seeing and hearing required believing in things that seemed impossible. Timothy had made me a better doctor by reminding me that behind every chart and diagnosis was a complete human being with a story that deserved to be told. My residency ended with honors, and I was offered a position on St. Catherine's pediatric staff, which I accepted. Some of my colleagues thought I was crazy to stay at the hospital where I'd had such an intense and troubling experience, but I felt connected to the place now, responsible for maintaining the changes Timothy's case had inspired. I continue to advocate for patient safety and transparency, earning a reputation as someone who would speak uncomfortable truths when necessary. It wasn't always easy, and I made enemies among those who preferred comfortable silence to difficult honesty, but I'd learned from a 7-year-old ghost that some things were worth fighting for regardless of personal cost. On the anniversary of Timothy's death, August 19th, a date I now marked every year, I held a remembrance ceremony in the Memorial Garden. It started as a small gathering of people directly involved in his story. Myself, Dr. Chun, a few board members, Sandra Clemens when her health allowed. But over the years it grew to include other staff members who'd been moved by his story, families of patients we'd saved because of the protocol changes his case inspired, medical students learning about ethical advocacy, and community members who saw Timothy's story as representative of larger issues in healthcare. During the 10th anniversary ceremony, something extraordinary happened. As I stood before the memorial stone, reading a passage,